Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of Chautauqua Aspen, the 50th birthday of the Aspen Historical Society. We're very happy to have you here today. Yesterday was so much fun, starting at 8 in the morning and continuing until about 11:30 last night when Mad World was done. 50 years, 1963. Of course, our Aspen history goes much farther back than that. And we here at the Aspen Historical Society are the caretakers and the communicators of that history. And as part of that, we have a very important capital campaign going on at the moment to sort of revive our archives and bring them up to modern museum standards. Now, as we approach $1 million in pledges, we are committed to continuing the renovation of our carriage house and breaking ground this fall. To do that, we need $1.5 million in pledges before we can actually break ground. And we thank you in advance for any interest, any contributions, any help you can give us toward reaching that goal. Next to me, of course, Georgia Hansen, our Executive Director, Mr. Walter Isaacson, the subject of this morning's coffee talk, and I'll give you a little bit of information about him, although you probably know a lot of it. He's the President and CEO of the Aspen Institute. He's been the Chairman and CEO of CNN and the editor of Time Magazine. The author of a book that came out about 2 years ago that's made a big splash on Steve Jobs. Also Einstein, His Life and Universe, Benjamin Franklin, An American Way of Life, and Kissinger, a biography. Also co-author of The Wise Men's 6 Friends and the World They Made. He's appointed by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the Senate to serve as chairman of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which oversees the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other international broadcasts of the United States. He's held that position since 2012. Vice Chair of Partners for a New Beginning, a public-private group tasked with forging ties between the United States and the Muslim world. He's on the boards of United Airlines, Tulane University, and the overseers of Harvard University. Mr. Walter Isaacson, and first, Georgia Hansen.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to thank Walter and let you know that he is a treasure. He's a treasure to history. I remember a speech at the American Association of Museums when Walter was the keynote speaker. He supports and understands the value of archives and of our storied past and understanding the context. So I just thank you.
Well, great. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. And I really appreciate just taking the tour of the archives. I mean, what you do here at the Historical Society is so important. The capital campaign, now that I've seen the archives, I see how important that's going to be for all of Aspen. Aspen is a very storied history, and I think it's really important that we preserve it. I'm doing a new book now, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about it and how it connects to the digital age and media that we're dealing with. It's not something I usually talk about, but I've been trying to formulate this new book. And it, too, is a history. Coming out of Steve Jobs and other books I've done, I wanted not to do a biography, but to do a collective biography. A look at a group of people who created the computer. Back in the, starting back in the 1940s. And so in some ways it's what we learn about in this day and age, which is that invention, innovation, and creativity are not simply individual things that somebody in an attic or a basement or a garage comes up with a light bulb, but is a collective thing, an iterative process where people work together. What particularly interested me is, even though my book, the main part of the book starts in the 1940s when, during World War II, when they're inventing the computer, it goes back 100 years before that to a woman named Ada Byron, Countess of Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter. She was the only legitimate child of Lord Byron, the Romantic poet. And those of you who know anything about Lord Byron know that by the time Ada was growing up, Lady Byron was not particularly fond of Lord Byron and wanted to make sure she didn't become a poet. Her father had sort of run off to Italy and would die in fighting in Greece. but her mother tutored her in mathematics on the theory that being a math, whiz would keep her from having what she worried about, her having a poetic sensibility. I realized this was interesting because to me, everything I've written about, whether it's Einstein, Steve Jobs, Benjamin Franklin, is the connection of creativity to the sciences or technology. This ability to be imaginative, but also connected to innovation and business. And so Ada stood at that intersection because she became a great mathematician, but she also became somebody who still had that poetic sensibility. And she called it poetical science. And what she did was she worked with a friend named Charles Babbage, who had created what was called the analytical engine, a machine that did calculations in the 1840s. And because Ada was interested in beauty and other things, she had traveled around France and looked at what was called the jacquard loom, which was a way of weaving beautiful patterns, but not by hand, doing it by punch card. Jacquard had created a way where you could do the algorithm of exactly which warp and woof, how you would spindle each thread. And he put it on punch cards so that you could make beautiful tapestries that were huge. And she realized that the notion of a punch card could be applied to a calculating machine, a numbers machine. And then, as she said, it would no longer just do numbers, it would no longer just be mathematical. It could spin any pattern. It could do anything that could be notated logically, meaning music, art, tapestries, mathematics, obviously. And she then wrote the series of instructions that would allow Babbage's machine to just do a variety of things. Some were calculations, some were more artistic. And that was the beginning of the algorithm and the beginning of the concept of the general purpose computer. A computer up until then had just been a calculating machine. She came up with this notion that a machine should be able to do everything that could be done sequentially with logical instructions. So it takes, she also has what's called Ada Lovelace's objection or limitation. Lady Lovelace, she ended up marrying the Earl of Lovelace, so her name is sometimes called Ada or Ada Lovelace or Ada Countess of Lovelace. Her objection was, or her limitation was, that machines will never be able to think. They'll never be able to creatively come up with their own ideas. Exactly 100 years later, one of the most interesting people in the world, Alan Turing, starts working on a computer in Bletchley Park, England, secretly in some grand manor house where Churchill had gathered the smartest people in England to create a machine that would break the German wartime code, the Enigma code, that was the German submarines and U-boats were using to communicate. And so Turing is able to come up with a variety of machines, eventually the Colossus, which in some ways is the first computer. It's not totally electronic, it uses electric-mechanical relays, so it's hard to define exactly what the first computer is, but it's one of the first machines that not only does mathematical things, but like Lady Lovelace said, could do different things, like take German-coded words and try to figure out what the Germans were saying to each other. And he became a student of Lady Lovelace. And he created the concept of what was called the universal machine, based on what Lovelace had written 100 years earlier. And the universal machine was, up until then, even after Lady Lovelace, most machines had a dedicated purpose, like the Colossus that was breaking the German code. It just did that. And what Turing said is we have to create a universal machine, a machine that you could program it to do anything you wanted. So that's really the beginning of the concept of the computer. He also came up with a really cool test. It was called the Turing test, to test whether Ada Lovelace was right about machines would never be able to think. This, by the way, is a wonderful philosophical question. Don't worry, there is no answer to it yet, or at least people still debate it. But if a machine could do everything a human mind could do, would it be correct to say the machine could think? Does it have consciousness? what is consciousness? You know, can consciousness be replicated in an electronic circuit? The Turing test simply said that if you took a machine, a great machine like Watson, the one that won a few years ago on Jeopardy, you put it behind a curtain, then you put a human being behind the curtain, and you let somebody who didn't know which was which have at it. And the person who didn't know which was which could ask any questions, type in questions, so you wouldn't be able to tell the difference by the voice. But you could type any question like, do you like Shakespeare's sonnets? You know, how cool is Aspen? You know, you could type in questions that tried to trick the machine and make the machine not understand what you were saying. And Turing, in 1950, wrote that by the end of the century, meaning the year 2000, there would be machines that would pass the Turing test, meaning after 20, 30 minutes, a person would not know the difference between the machine and the human behind the curtain. And he said, his second assertion was, and when that happens, it makes no sense to say machines don't think, because there'd be no way to show a machine didn't think. Both those assertions are controversial. Well, one really isn't, because by the end of 2000, we haven't developed such a machine, and even now, we haven't. Even Watson, the one who won on Jeopardy, probably could not pass the Turing test for more than 4 or 5 minutes. Anyone in this room could, despite the fact that Watson knew much more about every single fact that's in the encyclopedia, you could stump it with a few questions like, you know, poetic questions, whatever it may be, and it would not know how to answer you. But even more importantly, even if the machine could, it's not been really decided whether or not that means the machine has consciousness or can think. So those were the issues in the 1950s when the first computers got invented. As I say, one was at Bletchley Park, England, run by Alan Turing. Another was at the University of Pennsylvania. It became called ENIAC, which was done to do missile trajectories, and it was really the first electronic computer. Interestingly enough, before ENIAC was developed, somebody else had developed an electronic computer. And some people claimed that he was the first inventor of the computer. But it was one of those people I mentioned earlier who actually just worked in a garage all alone. And this guy, John Atanasoff, was a professor at the University of Iowa, and he tried to develop an electronic computer. He understood how to do the circuits and the yes-no switches and how to do something in binary. So if you had a question like, what's 7 plus 5, or any logical question, you could do it in binary code. So he came up with the concept and tried to do it, and he did it in the basement of the physics building in Iowa, but nobody there could help him, and his computer never really got working, and then he went off, was drafted into the Navy, did other things. The computer was even thrown away. There was no Aspen Historical Society. There are a few pieces of it left, but they broke it up and threw most of it away because they needed the space in the physics building. And really that becomes the question is, did this guy invent the computer? No, not really, because he never had the team around him, not only to get it built, but to have it have an effect on future generations of computers. On the contrary, the same people were doing the same type of thing at the University of Pennsylvania, and there were hundreds of people working with them. This was funded by the Defense Department. It was Aberdeen Proving Ground and University of Pennsylvania working together. John von Neumann, Alan Turing came over from England to help. And they create this computer, and every computer since then comes from ENIAC and UNIVAC, Sperry Rand, IBM. They're all based on what's called the von Neumann architecture. So in the annals of writing about history and inventing, you sometimes have to say, well, what if somebody came up with something in a basement in Iowa and then never really finished it because he didn't have the team? Does that count as an invention? Whether or not it does is really a matter of semantics. What's important, though, as we think it through, is that in this new day and age, as I said, invention is not something you can just do all alone in your basement. It needs to be done when you're connecting people with great creativity, great ideas, with great engineers, great mechanics. You know, and that's why Bell Labs and University of Pennsylvania become so important, because they're combining the person who knows how to do pole climbing and string telephone wires with the person who knows how to do relay switches with the theoretical physicist and the mathematician. And so it's teams of people that actually create progress and new innovation in this digital age. So that's the framework of the early part of the book I'm doing. As somebody who's been involved in media, I've watched the advent of the computer and the digital technology and how it affected us. When I first started working as a journalist in the late 1970s, the personal computer was just coming into its own. Apple came out with the Apple II in the late 70s. The Mac, the first original Mac, is not done famously until 1984, with the great 1984 ad that Steve Jobs does for the Mac. So in the beginning of my career, people did not have personal computers. Computers existed, but they were terminals and they were all networked. That may seem like a minor distinction, but back then, at least in the 70s, computers were thought of as a way to communicate. They were not thought of as just a personal device, but you would be on a terminal, like a terminal probably here in the museum or in the library. And it would be not a very smart terminal, didn't have a lot of processing power in it, but it was connected to all sorts of terminals and to a server, where you could look things up, just like we do on the internet today. But beginning in the late 1970s, and for 2 full decades, there's sort of a shift. And computers become very personal. You have your own, probably most of you remember in the late 80s or 90s, you got your first IBM PC or whatever. But they had all the stuff on it, but it wasn't really just a terminal to talk to other people. They were disconnected. It's not until the internet really comes into its own in the 1990s that once again personal computers become network computers, and you can do email, share things, blog, post things, and computers become what they really needed to be, not just a productivity tool that you used at the office, but a communication tool that allowed you to network and social network. Those type of things were really cool, but they totally undermined media by the end of the 1990s when the internet comes on. I was very lucky. I edited Time magazine throughout the 1990s, and those of you can remember back then, remember there was sort of an internet bubble and then a crash in the early 2000s. I was lucky because I rode the bubble, which meant that even a printed magazine, and we also had Time Daily, Time Online, Time websites, we could just print money because advertising agencies didn't understand this new medium, so they were just buying banner ads for large amounts of money on any page you put up online, as well as everybody was starting new companies in the internet bubble like petfood.com or whatever, and they were taking out pages in our magazine to advertise. So it was a heyday for media, but one thing happened during that heyday for media. I remember, because I was editor of Time, starting what we called Roadrunner, Pathfinder, and our various internet services. And what we were going to do when we put up all of Time magazine and all of our bureaus, and you're going to be able to get things directly from our bureaus, and we were going to create a great news service for you, is you were going to have to pay for it. Henry Luce, when he invented Time magazine in 1923, wrote a prospectus, and he said that any media, any publication, should have 2 forms of revenue, advertising and the user, the reader, he called it. And he said, otherwise you become beholden to the advertiser. And you don't want to create a magazine that's just totally beholden to catering to advertisers. You want your loyalty to be both to your readers and to your advertisers. And he wanted a 50-50 revenue split. So when we created the new media of Time Inc. and Time Warner in the 1990s, we said, okay, and we are going to charge people either a subscription or $1 when they come buy the magazine. But something happened that knocked us off that path, which seemed like a good thing at the time. As I was running our new media, as soon as we started putting up Time magazine and other things online, as I said, the advertising agencies on Madison Avenue were so astounded by this new form of media that they just kept throwing dollars at us for the banner ads. And the CPMs, meaning the cost per 1,000 eyeballs we would show them, kept going up and up and up. So we decided you can make more money just taking advertising dollars and not charging the user, because you wanted to have as many eyeballs, so to speak. You wanted to have as many users, as many clicks, as many visitors as you could get. And somehow we got seduced by the pot of gold that temporarily, at least, was sitting there on Madison Avenue with young ad execs running across to, Rockefeller Center, where we were based, to give us bags of money to buy banner ads on our internet sites. This, in my mind, was a mistake in the late 1990s, early 2000s, to make every bit of content on the internet free, or apparently free, and have it all be advertising subsidized. A couple of reasons, true. One is the Henry Luce maxim, is that if you now look at big old free sites on the internet, they tend to cater to advertisers. You don't have people doing great, at least earning a living, doing great investigative work or covering what's happening in Egypt or opening Cairo bureaus of things, because it's much easier to do a website that's the 20 best strollers, and you get advertising from people making baby equipment or something. Secondly, the problem was that anybody could start internet sites, from Matt Drudge to Ariana Huffington or whatever. They could start it without having journalists around the world. So the number of internet pages, beginning in 2000, went up exponentially. I mean, just every month it seemed, the number of pages and pages that people had created and sites that people had created on the internet had gone up by a factor of 10. But advertising dollars basically flatlined, or at least in the early 2000s even went down a bit. Chevrolet was not putting out more cars, Sony wasn't putting out new television. So the advertising dollars at best stayed the same. The sites went up, and with a, modest supply of advertising dollars and a huge supply of places they could put their ads, the price of ads plummeted. So that would, if you used to be able to get 10 cents for every impression that you gave an advertiser, it went down to 1/1000th of a cent. I mean, it was, and Google started doing ad search, so everybody could put ads on their internet site. And that ended the business model for journalism that had existed for about 300 years. 300 years since the statute of Anne created copyright laws that sort of said you can print things and charge for them, and you have intellectual property rights to it. That whole system broke down. There's an upside and a downside. I mean, I love the fact that nowadays you get more informed than you've ever been. Even though journalism has collapsed, even though none of the networks have bureaus much overseas, and newspapers and national newspapers, national magazines, Newsweek, they've all basically gone under. But still, if I want to know what's happening in Egypt, I can get up this morning, and I got more sources about what's happening in Egypt, including bloggers in Egypt and Twitter feeds, but more importantly for me, local newspapers around the region who have people there. So it's good for the consumer, and it's also good that we don't have gatekeepers. I say this having been a gatekeeper. And then, from the 1950s to 2000, there were about 3 great gatekeepers when it came to the network news. Crime Time would say that's the way it is, and those 3 networks would tell you what was important for half an hour. There were 3 magazines, if you were national magazine readers: Time, Newsweek, U.S. News. There were a few newspapers, and we who were the editors of those things kind of decided this is news, this isn't, whatever. That was fun for those of us who got to be gatekeepers, but it's probably a bad idea. There was an elite sitting there in Manhattan saying, this is news, this isn't. Nowadays, anybody can decide what's news and share news however they want. So all these are good things. I do think that the one bad thing is we've not yet reinvented the business model. At some point, it's a good idea, and I may be old-fashioned, but it's a good idea to be able to take people like myself when I come out of college and say, you can have a career as a reporter, and we're going to we're an organization, in this case, the Times-Picayune of New Orleans and Time Magazine and Sunday Times of London, the places I work, and we're going to send you to Morocco, or we're going to send you to Baton Rouge, or we're going to put you on the campaign plane with Ronald Reagan and whatever. And we're going to pay, and that's going to cost a lot of money. It's $1 million a month to keep a Baghdad bureau open, but it still costs money even to put a reporter on the campaign trail covering politics, or reporters anywhere doing things. I get very frustrated when my daughter and some of her friends say, oh, I don't need to read the New York Times. I get my news from Google News. And I say, who does Google have in Baghdad? You know, who does Google have covering Pakistan at the moment? Who did Google have covering the Super Bowl? I mean, nobody. They're just picking things up from other, and not having a business model in which the organizations that pay for reporters get compensated for that. I think that there'll probably be ways to break that paradigm, to come up with a new business model. The simplest is what the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others are doing, which is after you've read 3 or 4 articles, you know, or 10 articles in some cases, from their publications in a given month, they say, okay, subscribe now. I think it'll be soon that your browser will have a wallet in it. It will be easier to just pay for things, where it's like an easy pass, where nowadays, if you reach your 10-article limit at the New York Times, you may not want to put in a credit card or go to PayPal or do all the passwords you need. But if you could just click and say, yeah, give it $5, and it would be the same way you click. I don't know if you have easy passes out here, but you know, where you have like a digital wallet, that'll help people pay for content. But at the moment, we've broken the old business model, haven't come up with a new business model, and I think it's undermining quality journalism. I'll end with an optimistic note, is that most people, not most people, a lot of people, 30–40% of this country, really do want quality journalism. That's a huge number of people, and those people tend to have the resources and the desire to pay a few bucks for it. Just like they'll pay a lot to go to the movie theater here to see a movie they want to see. For half the price of that movie ticket, they could buy a month of a newspaper or a magazine. And I think there wouldn't be an objection to that if we make it easy for people to do it. And even though maybe half this nation would rather just, you know, geek out on junky entertaining news and shout shows about whether or not, you know, Trayvon Martin did or didn't do something, there's still and will always be, a market for people saying, I really do want to know what's happening. I really do want a real reporter to give me information. That is of value to me, at least as much of a value as a cup of coffee from Starbucks or a ticket in a movie theater. I'll pay a few bucks every week to get quality news. So I think we're going to go into a period where finally people will come up with the business models that create quality news. And with that, my exact half hour is up. So I will answer a few questions and then let you get back to coffee and dessert. Yes, way back and then second way back. Yeah.
Thank you. During what you termed the gatekeeper period, did you notice in journalism, either print or TV, the kind of polarization that we see today? MSNBC, Obama can do no wrong. Fox, Obama can do no right.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The technology of broadcast media, meaning 3 networks, 2 or 3 news magazines, whatever, meant that in order to succeed, you aimed at getting at least more than a third of the audience. I mean, if there are 3 networks, you win if you get a little bit more than a third. To get 1/3 of America, you have to have a generally broad-based and open sense. To succeed on Fox or MSNBC, you need to get 1 or 2% of the audience. That's all it takes, because there are now 100, 200 channels. If you look at the ratings of Fox, it's approximately 2% of viewers any time. So to get a passionate 2% takes a different editorial model than trying to appeal to a broad base. So Huntley and Brinkley and, you know, Cronkite or Frank Reynolds or whoever it was had to appeal to a broader base to try to, you know, and that meant bringing people together rather than polarizing them. If you're on the talk radio dial and you just want that core audience, of talk radio fanatics who are conservative or liberal. That'll give you 2 or 3%, and you'll win the talk radio race in your market because there are 50 channels. Likewise, there are 500 channels, but maybe 50 places a person would go in the evening for entertainment, news, whatever, sports. So it's almost by dint of the technology drives it to a more polarized place because you're aiming for that passionate 3 or 4% of people to get 2 or 3% of the people to just, and when I ran CNN, we had an enormous number more viewers than Fox. But Fox was catching up back then in the ratings. Why? Because the viewer would turn on O'Reilly or a Fox show, and unlike a CNN show, they'd watch CNN for 8, 10, 12 minutes to try to figure out what was going on, and then remote control, they'd be off somewhere else. Once you were a passionate fan of Bill O'Reilly, you watched at least, on average, 59.5 minutes of a 60-minute show. So the ratings came because people stuck with it. That, too, encouraged passionate, polarizing talk radio type hosts rather than, Aaron Brown, who was the show I put on, saying, also in the news, a plane and saying, that type of thing. So this is true, you can see historically. I mean, when Benjamin Franklin comes to Philadelphia, there are 10 newspapers in Philadelphia. He starts the 11th newspaper. When there's a low barrier to entry and you're just trying to get a small share of the market, most of the papers in Philadelphia were, as we would say today, polarized. There was the one run by the proprietors, the Anglicans had one, there was a sort of working class tabloid, there was a newspaper that was kind of loyalist to the crown, there was sort of a more rebellious one. So when you have multiple entries into a market, you tend to polarize. And then secondly, I think the media just lost its way and became more interested in titillating and polarizing than bringing people together.
In your evolution of the computer, might I suggest that you include the anecdote that...
Sorry.
Oops, I'm sorry.
Right there.
That you include the anecdote that George Dyson gave about the Maniac at Princeton in terms of its size. Now, the footprint was about as big as this tent, but a question for your audience, what do you suppose was the size of the memory of the Maniac that was responsible for simulating the hydrogen bomb explosions?
Very large.
So how many kilobytes, how many megabytes, how many gigabytes?
Well, I think you've made your point. It's very small. Thanks. Next.
Yes, Walter, to the point that your daughters had made, about going digital as opposed to a written form of communication in the newspaper. Do you think when digital really goes, which it will, to being paid subscribers, that wipe out the newspapers?
No, I think if you have paid for just some form of consumer revenue or user revenue, I'll call it, and I do think this new generation would be quite happy to do it. I mean, they do it. When I was younger, we all shared music, and music was Napstered and pirated, and nobody paid for music for a whole decade. And my daughter's generation, somehow, they're on iTunes, and they don't mind the 99 cents or $1.29. So people pay. If there is a model where readers and users are paying a little bit for journalism, you get the perfect hybrid, which is an organization can create, say, a newspaper, a magazine, whatever it may be. They can offer it digitally and in print and make revenue streams from both. Paper is not a bad technology. I mean, if we've been getting all of our information on the internet for 400 years, and somebody said, hey, I can take this information and actually put it in a form on paper and bind it together and deliver it to your doorstep, and you can take it on the bus or the bath or the backyard, you'd say, wow, paper, that's a great technology. That might replace the internet someday. So I would say that as with ebooks that have been around for, a decade, you'll probably get to an equilibrium where approximately 70% of the journalism you consume will be consumed electronically and maybe 30% on paper. Right now it's 60-40 in terms of 60% new books, especially fiction, pulp fiction, 60% are consumed electronically, 40% on paper. I think it'll change somewhat, but it will be a golden age for people who produce newspapers because you will get two revenue streams and the marginal cost of delivering your electronic copy is almost zero. So if you're the New York Times or the Times-Picayune or the New Orleans Advocate or whatever newspaper you are, and you've got somebody covering City Hall and that person is creating an online blog, that person's stories are online, that person's stories are delivered on paper in the newspaper, and people are paying no matter how they're getting those stories. This is an enormous upside that I think will save journalism. Okay. Let me go to one there.
Just as a follow-up, the Steve Jobs book, which we all love so much, and looking forward to your new book. Could you give us the numbers of Kindle to, I've never bought the book. I put it on Kindle because we were traveling, it was so heavy.
Yeah, that's interesting. Steve Jobs is a slightly different than some other books, meaning if you bought a Dan Brown novel, the electronic versus physical editions would be different. At the very beginning, there was a huge surge of sales for Steve Jobs, not because of me, but because when Steve died, it was a huge deal, and the book just, sold, better than any book of that type for a while. Initially, approximately 80% were physical. Partly because the cover of the book, which Steve had helped design, it was almost a totem. It was like an object of the True Cross or something. And people who love Steve, that first few weeks, they wanted the object. The picture, the clean cover, the whole physical nature of the book. And so that shot up. It was October. It started to level off after a couple of weeks. People were just buying this as a, they needed the physical object. Then as we got into the Christmas season, it once again became approximately 80-20, meaning 80% of the books were physical, 20% electronic, because it's hard to give an ebook as a gift. And people were giving it, most sales of books tend to quintuple, go up fivefold going into Christmas, and for obvious reasons. And so those tend to be physical. As soon as the Christmas season was over, it hit a equilibrium of approximately 50-50, where it has stayed for the past 2 years. There are periods, including now, where the ebook sales are higher, because people are going on summer vacation traveling. But a month and a half ago, the physical book sales were higher, because you're going into graduation and Father's Day, and people were buying it as graduation or Father's Day gifts. I would say for a normal book, we're about at 50-50, in the future. For fiction and airport reading, it's 60-40. And eventually I said, I think we get to 70-30. I don't know, depending on the book. But I do think physical books will almost always survive. Maybe not the Dan Brown airport novel, but a biography will always come out in physical form. It's not that expensive, despite you think, okay, how do you get to make trees? Do you have to kill or whatever? It costs about, $4 to produce a physical book. So I think physical books will continue to exist.
You've written about an incredible spectrum of very interesting people. You've had some phenomenal conversations as part of the Aspen Institute and put off Reference TV. At the 100,000-foot level, how do you go about preparing to get into that? Do you have an interview, live interview discussion, or interview?
Yeah, it depends on different things. If the person is alive, Steve Jobs, I met here at the Sarding House. I've known him since 1984. when we first started doing the book, we'd meet at the Sardi House and take long walks around Aspen. We talk about his childhood. If it's Ben Franklin, I start by reading the secondary material, meaning every other biography and book written, and then I go the 40 volumes of Franklin's papers, and I go through all of that. Nowadays, it's of course difficult because people don't write letters. So if I'm trying to do the invention of the personal computer in the 1970s, I go to Bill Gates. I spent 3 or 4 days in Seattle, do a lot of interviews with Bill Gates. Well, when I say something like, show me the letters that you wrote in the late 1970s and 80s with Paul Allen and trying to figure out the IBM deal, whatever, you know, we don't have that documentary. And one of my tiny crusades, and this works well for a historical archive, is historical archivists are always looking to get the papers. You know, let's find Mortimer Adler's papers and see if they should be here, whatever. I talked to Bill Gates, and throughout the 70s and 80s, he's sending 50 emails an hour. Those emails are lost. I mean, I have tried, because I'm a historian, to keep all my emails beginning in the late 1980s, when I started doing new media for Time Age and we were creating new media. It is very difficult to keep emails, meaning every time I get a new computer system, I have a folder which I've dumped all the important emails, like my emails with Time Inc. and CBS, where we're trying to create new media things. And I try to have some techie reconvert them from whatever ATEX email system to CompuServe to, you know, Apple to whatever. And it's a mess. And even now, recently, somebody was writing a book on the 1990s and how the media companies responded to the digital age. I said, great, I've got all my emails. And it took about a day for a tech person at the Aspen Institute to take those emails that I had thought I'd kept pretty current and convert them into text form. I finally discovered that the best way to save for an archivist to have emails, if Harvard wants Bill Gates' emails, the only way to really have it done is to have them printed all out on paper, put them in shoeboxes, and put a label on it and say, you know, 1981 to 82 on it. Because this is why paper is not the world's worst technology. You buy books, e-books, as I do all the time. In 10 years, no matter how much Amazon promises you, you'll be able to access them, those books will not be readable on your, you know, Google Glass or whatever you're reading on in 10 years. Whereas the books you buy on paper, you'll be able to go back to. So, you know, I'm not fully answering the question of all my methods of doing things, but I've been thinking about those of us who try to do history, and I'm thinking about the archives here. We will lose history starting in late 1950s when people quit writing letters every day and long-distance phone calls came in. And nowadays, we do have an amazing archive, maybe the NSA is the only place that keeps it for it, of all of our conversations and decisions, but we are not, but librarians and archivists, whether it be here, with all due respect to the one here, or at Harvard, they are not saying, nobody's ever come to me and saying, we want the history of Aspen, how the Aspen Ideas Festival came along. Would you give us all your emails from 10 years ago when you and Kitty Moon and others were coming up with ideas? I'm not pretending that that's as important of an invention as the computer or something, but nobody's doing that to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs saying, I mean, Steve Jobs died, his papers are Stanford, whatever, but nobody said, where are his emails? And let's put them in an historical archive.
Yeah. I have two questions. The first one is just since we're here considering the history of Aspen as a historical society, place-based newspapers, the digital thing is so placeless. And yet for me, growing up in a small town newspaper was such a point of orientation. So is the Boulder for us.
Well, the digital age is place-based. Newspapers do pretty well. But the internet can do hyper-local. In other words, New Orleans now has 2 newspapers, because it's in a bit of a newspaper war, but it has 20 hyper-local sites. Like my neighborhood of Central City in Broadmoor, New Orleans, has its own daily, cross between a newspaper blog and bulletin board saying the electricity's out at the Rosa Keller, you know, community center or something. So, but what killed the localism of newspapers was not so much whether or not you were interested in local. It was classified ads and the fact that local newspapers no longer had a monopoly on classified. And although you like local news, if you were to buy a used car, the question for me is, do you go to your paper and look at the classifieds, or do you go online to do it? And if the answer is the latter, your local newspaper is going to have. Now, Aspen's a totally different case. I mean, free newspapers for a upscale audience that advertisers need, you know, during the summer. But in general, if you're going to Jackson, Mississippi, and you live there, if you buy a car online or go to Craigslist or whatever, versus a classified newspaper, that newspaper's not going to have a good, healthy business.
Now, I did not realize I was going to be so nostalgic for Waterfront. Right? And when you were speaking of the gatekeepers, I was saying 20 years ago, we used to lament the information overload. And I think we gave up lamenting and just learned to live with it. But I worry about the absence of gatekeepers and the sorting of such a vast.
Yeah, I prefer to have both a gatekeeper, meaning a filter, I guess is the better way to say it now in the digital age, and somebody saying this is important.
That's what
And I got plenty of time, I'm online a lot, so maybe I'm old-fashioned. I go to a couple of sites that I feel tell me what's important. Some are old media and some are new. Every morning for my hit on politics and a few other things, I go to Real Clear Politics. It just lists what somebody, and I don't even know who it is that day, that morning said, here are the 15 most interesting articles, left, right, and center, on politics today. They'll give me a Dana Milbank from the Washington Post, they'll give me someone from the LA Times, might give me a blogger from Des Moines, Iowa, and those are the 15 things, and I'll glance through that. There's also one for science that I love, and there's one for. I also go to Politico's front page, that's a newbie, but I also do the New York Times front page every day. Like it or not, for the past 40 years, I've vaguely trusted that if something's on the front page of the New York Times, I need to know about it, or if it's in the paper, I need to know about it, or if it's on the front page of the book review or the theater section or whatever, I need to know about it. Or their Science Tuesday section. So those to me are my gatekeepers. The problem is not a lack of gatekeepers or filters. There are almost too many aggregators that popped up 10 years ago. Matt Drudge popped up. He has, you know, he's one guy sitting around, but he's aggregating and gatekeeping for you, making a mint, whereas the people he's aggregating aren't making as much money. I mean, he's making a fortune because of his traffic. And yeah, he sends traffic to other people's sites, but they get the leftover advertising. That used to be true of the Huffington Post, which was an aggregator of other people's journalism. Now the Huffington Post hires its own journalists, so it's actually something I go to.
I think it was in the New York Times, read about a Syrian man who died. He, young, he was in his 20s, and he started out documenting what was going on in Syria. He never carried a gun.
Yeah.
Is there, I don't know how this would work, but could newspapers somehow reimburse this person? I mean, he's dead, but
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a question of citizen journalism.
To get the actual news.
Right. It's a question of citizen journalism all over the world. I mean, if I need stuff from Tahrir Square right now, besides Ben Wiedemann of CNN, you know, there's all sorts of people blogging, tweeting, and you have to then figure out, is it real, or is it somebody put up something fake to try to sway you one side or the other? Citizen journalism is really cool. I mean, it does a whole lot of things. And people are, I mean, my daughter, who writes for the Huffington Post yesterday, wrote an article just about an arrest that happened on the 4th of July in New Jersey, on the big pier, a big firework. And the interesting thing was, a small thing happened, a few people got arrested. But a person with Google Glass on was able to record the whole thing, and 20 people with iPhones recorded it, and it sort of became covered by citizen journalism. None of those people get compensated, but we do have this whole new wealth of unfiltered material. You have absolutely, all you're seeing is raw video. Some of it could be fake. You don't know what it is. But somehow we're going to have to incorporate that citizen journalism into real journalism, where an Anderson Cooper might have a show on CNN and say, okay, I'm going to get videos from everybody, you know, trying to cover this hurricane, and we're going to curate it for you. But I don't quite see how that works as a business model for the people doing it. And I'll just end with this. I'll make this last question. People do, though, like contributing information. There is a Wikipedia phenomenon. People sometimes make fun of Wikipedia and say it's not reliable. I have found Wikipedia on most things, and you can usually smell when somebody's yanking around on Wikipedia. On most things, it's more reliable than most encyclopedias or something. And it's because people have a strong desire to share information, and they do it for free on Wikipedia. So that notion of collectively being journalistic, or in the case of Wikipedia, contributing to knowledge, will help make a better digital media in the future. That said, and it ties into your question, I am still going to want, and I think society in general will still want, people that people trust. And you can choose who you trust, I can choose who I trust, you can say I trust Matt Drudge to curate for me, I can say no, I trust Politico to curate for me. But need people you trust to say, we've gathered this information, we've done our darndest to authenticate it, to make sure it's not somebody faking something or whatever. And we're very good at having a dialogue, so if somebody tells us we got something wrong, you're going to know it right away, we're not going to hunker down. We're going to earn your trust with credibility, honesty, good reporting, or whatever. And once we earn your trust, once you say, you know, I'm going to go to you each morning, because you've always been honest with me, you've made mistakes, but you corrected them right away, and you explained how the mistakes were made, you've gotten good journalism together, and that filter, that editor, that packager, that curator says, and I'm going to charge you $10 a day if you don't mind. You know, not much. I want you to click every month and give me $3. That, I hope, will be the future. People say, hey, $10 a day? Yeah, fine. That's worth it to me. $3 a month, whatever. Which, by the way, you know, New York Times has 4 million users. You do the math, you know, $3. And they'll charge more, you know, $10 a month, say $100 a year, $100 times, you know, 3 or 4 million people. You could have a golden age of journalism for brand names and media companies that produce information you trust. If we could just get over the hump of everybody thinking, do all that for me and never charge me any money for it, I think you'll get to the golden age of newspapers, as you said, but also of all media companies. Thank you.